Hello, my name's Lee Matheson. As was mentioned, I am with the Future of Privacy Forum. Specifically, I am a policy counsel on the global privacy team. And I have the pleasure to introduce three fantastic panelists in the AI space to all of you today for what I think will be a fairly illuminating conversation around the concept of explainability. First is Dr. Sarah Jordan, joining us also from the FPF, where she is the senior researcher on artificial intelligence and ethics. She has worked with the privacy implications of data sharing, data and AI review boards, privacy analysis for AI and machine learning, and in general, overall, written a lot about the ethics challenges of AI and ML. Next up is Renato Monteiro, who is the co-founder of Data Privacy Brazil and a doctoral candidate at the University of Sao Paulo. He has also written extensively on AI and machine learning, and particularly on ethics in AI and machine learning, and was closely involved in the drafting of Brazil's General Data Protection Law, the LGPD. He holds CIPP Europe, CIPM, and FIP certifications from the IAPP. And last but certainly not least is Christina Montgomery, who is the Chief Privacy Officer and a Vice President of IBM. Christina has been with IBM since the mid-90s and has been the Chief Privacy Officer now for a number of years. She, as the Chief Privacy Officer, oversees all of IBM's privacy programs, as well as compliance and privacy strategy on a global basis. She also chairs IBM's AI Ethics Board, which is a multidisciplinary team responsible for the governance and decision-making process for all IBM AI ethics policies and practices. So as you can see, we've got a panel of fairly heavy hitters on the subject of AI ethics and particularly explainability. And when I say explainability here, I guess I'll introduce our panel's topic to some extent. Explainability is not exactly the same thing as transparency, and it is a concept that comes up a lot specifically in connection with AI, automated decision-making, and machine learning technologies. I'm actually going to cite briefly to a 2020 piece published in Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society by scholars Jessica Fjeld and Adam Nagy, arguing that the core problem of explainability is how to translate technical concepts and decision outputs into intelligible, comprehensible formats. That is something that I pulled from what I think is a great paper on this subject. But to start off our discussion today, I'd like to get an initial reaction from each of my panelists on what they think of that as a definition of explainability, and on a related note, what they think the greatest challenge is in achieving explainability for artificial intelligence and automated decision-making technologies. So I guess to start us off, I'm going to throw the ball to you first, Sarah.
Sure, thanks, Lee, and thanks both Christina and Renato for joining us this afternoon. I look at this definition of explainability, and I have to key on two words that they use to support the definition, which is intelligibility and comprehensibility. Making something intelligible really depends on the target audience that you're trying to make it intelligible for. And then comprehensibility depends upon the audience's ability to take that information that you as the writer, you as the producer believe is intelligible, and to take it on board and to do something with it. Because one of the challenges that I think is inherent in creating explainable AI or explainability in many of the other tech domains is making sure that people who have something that is explained to them can absorb it, interpret it, and then do something with it that is positive within their own lives, whether or not that is to ensure that they receive a benefit or to protect themselves from what they perceive as a harm. Let me stop there and pass it back to you.
So would it be fair to say that you'd push back a little bit on the idea that there is, such a thing as, I guess, universal explainability that you could have?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Renato, how about you? What do you think?
Okay, so thanks. Good evening, good afternoon. I don't know where everybody is. So thanks, Lee, Christina, and Sarah, and Wheel for the invitation here. I guess I pretty much agree with what Sarah said. My idea of explainability is much more than providing explanation, the technical concepts, but allowing for the individuals, let's say here, data subjects, to use that particular information that they will provide it to them in different manners, depending on the level of the target audience, let's say, and how to maybe challenge automated decision making in order to guarantee their fundamental rights. So this is the way I see it. But in order, and Lee, you also asked, in top of the concept, if we agree with the concept, what would be like the top limitations in order to provide a right explanation, explainability? And I guess just to start here, I would provide like 4 different limitations that I foresee. I guess the first limitation that I foresee are the technical ones, that in order to really understand what it's go underneath or within what we sometimes call black box and other concept that we know for a while, and to comprehend that. The other one would be even legal limitations when we talk about commercial secrets in intellectual property and how to address that. And I know we're going to tackle that a lot here. The other ones is, I would say, epistemologic, from a level perspective from the data subject, in order to allow a comprehensible explanation. And there is the issue of language and how to translate those technical concepts. And even if providing a translation is the right path for it, and we can also discuss that. And I guess the last one would be institutional. Who is going to really enforce a right to explanation? Are we talking, for example, data protection authorities? Are we talking to some other peers, some other stakeholders? Are we talking for a third sector? So I guess every single dimension of these 4 topics has their own limitations, and all of them have to be addressed in order to really provide a right explanation. And I'll stop here so we can continue.
That's fantastic, Renato. And we are definitely going to come back to that discussion, particularly about how explainability ties into intellectual property and commercial secrets. But I think before we do that, I would love to get Christina's opinion.
Sure, and thank you. I'll echo, it's a real pleasure to join this group and to talk about this topic. So thank you so much for inviting me. I think of explainability as information related to the particular decision and why the decision was made, right? And explainability, as I think about it, is a way to enhance transparency. So transparency being the broader information about what went into the system and how it was trained and the data that was used and how it's deployed and all of that. Explainability being the one way to, but being very related to the decision itself. And then I agree, all the challenges that Sarah and Renato discussed, I completely agree with. I think, part of the challenge is what explainability, what is legally sufficient, what for explainability, like under GDPR, where you have to provide a meaningful explanation, what does that mean? It's very contextual in nature. So being able to provide meaningful explanations to an individual user or to the data scientist that's developing the AI application, those are very different things. So I think this contextuality is a challenge as well. And then contextuality with respect to the end application. Some applications have very high stakes, and the level of granularity that you would provide in the context of a decision in a high stakes arena or high stakes area would be very different than the level of explainability that you would expect from an AI system in, say, a retail or a very more low stakes kind of a context.
Great. So would it be fair to say that you look at explainability more in terms of the specific interaction with a user that an AI or a machine learning system may be having than like a broader transparency obligation that attaches to an entire product or an entire piece of software?
Yeah, I mean, that's how I think about it. What is the explanation or the reason for the decision that the system is making in that particular context?
Fantastic. And I think that actually provides a pretty good segue to my next question to all of you, because one of the things that I'm interested in this panel is nailing down, if such a thing, can be nailed down, where you draw the line between general transparency obligations and explainability, particularly as we're talking about it in this context. And I think, Christina's really got something here when we're talking about explainability is really when a particular AI or ML system is making a particular decision. That's where this principle comes in as the individual, whether they're an internal customer, a business to business customer, a consumer out on the market, how they interact with that decision. So to that, I'd like to throw to all of you the question of how you view explainability as it interacts with existing privacy requirements. We've touched on this a little bit more already, but in a more, for lack of a better word, more mature data protection structure like the GDPR that has its Article 12 and 13 and 14 and 15 transparency requirements, how do those and the, I guess, at least a little bit settled means of making those disclosures, privacy policies, cookie banners, et cetera, how does that interact with how you see explainability? And I guess immediately I'd like to go back to Christina on that question.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, when you look at a regulation like the GDPR, it's addressing personal information, but in a technologically neutral way. So privacy laws are covering the processing of personal information through AI systems, but not all AI systems are processing personal information. And then, so that's sort of the trick of it, I think, in the sense that it's, I think, also covered from the perspective of the main underlying principles of the GDPR. So things like law, the concepts of lawfulness and fairness and transparency. Arguably, those are the same principles, right, that apply in the context of explainability, that you shouldn't, especially in the context of not processing personal data in a way that is unexpected or misleading to the data subject. But I think that in the GDPR itself, with respect to AI specifically, it's only addressing, so when we talk about that requirement to provide meaningful information in the context, it's only in the context of an automated decision without sort of human oversight. So there's a very limited subset of AI systems to which the GDPR is applying. So I think overall, the concept and the elements of explainability are addressed in existing privacy regulations to some extent. But ultimately, there are areas where there isn't coverage. As I said, it's especially in the context where there's no personal information necessarily being processed by a system, it wouldn't be covered by a privacy regulation. So I think the way I think about it in terms of, or at least how we think about explainability at IBM, is that it's really a key concept of developing and delivering trustworthy AI irrespective of privacy laws. So in our own principles, we include commitments to have explainable and transparent AI systems as part of the principles that we model everything after. So anyway, that's that. So again, I think there's overlap from a conceptual perspective already in existing privacy laws, but not 100%.
That's a particularly interesting tie-in, I think, with the role of internal policies that large companies and large AI providers, particularly general AI providers like IBM, adopt in making sure that this principle is, I guess, recognized and available in markets that may not be subject to just one regulation or just another regulation. Actually, I think at this point, I would love to flip over to Renato and get your perspective on how basically the same question, but vis-a-vis the obligations under the new Brazil general personal law, the LGBT. And particularly, I'd love to hear your perspective on how that might be different in a specific way from the GDPR, and how that, if it does, in your opinion, interact differently with what we're sort of discussing as an underlying ethical principle of AI or ML?
Early, I guess this is kind of funny because the very question you posed is the core research of my PhD research. I added the question where the question is that, is there a right to explanation on the Brazilian general data protection law? I know that there is this transatlantic discussion that we see on the academia, if there is or there is not a proper right to explanation. Article 13, 14, 15, recital 71 of GDPR and so forth. And I compared that to the Brazilian general data protection law, where there is not a proper mention, it is not enshrined in the regulation that you can something that is more than transparency obligations. So therefore, we need to, if we are to advocate in order that there is a right and explanation under the Brazilian legislation, we need to derive that from other sources, and I guess it is possible to derive that from other sources. If we do an interpretation, an integrative interpretation, not only of the Brazilian general data protection law, but credit reporting law, consumer law, and some other laws that we have here, even the right to review, I guess we can even say that the right explanation exists even before the Brazilian data protection law. But not only that, because sometimes if you are working with, if you are in a more formalistic legal environment, they would say, no, it is not written in the law. You cannot really you cannot really say that there is such a right. So, but if we can also derive such a right in the Brazilian when we say about information self-determination, and there's a way to provide the data subject a way to know what is going to be, not only what's going to be done with their data, but what will be the impacts of the automated decision making on their lives. And also we can even derive that from information due process. And I know in the US, it is a very, if we talk about fair information principles and what is being, the FTC has been doing in order to get some of the data protection rights and obligations that we have in some other regions of the world, that is included on information due process, like some academics like Crawford have mentioned. So when it comes to that, I guess we can really say that there is a right explanation under the Brazilian law. And it is more than just transparency obligations. But there is one particular concept that I guess it is different from GDPR, and it is also different from the approach that you have in the EU draft regulation, is that we know that the concept of personal data under GDPR has been sometimes called like the law of everything. In the end, like personal data can be anything that is allows for singling out a person. But there is one particular article under the Brazilian law that says that even anonymized data or not non-personal data, if it is used for profiling purpose, for grouping, let's say, it will be deemed as personal data. So therefore, if we are using automated decision making without personal data or anonymized data, and that has a particular impact on an individual or on a group, we can say that the law would apply. And if we say that the law would apply, and you can infer the right explanation from these different methods, we can even say that there is our right explanation would have a larger scope, therefore more obligations they would have under the GDPR and the EU drafts, the AI draft proposition.
So what I think I'm hearing from you is sort of a similar, I guess, interaction-focused analysis of whatever this explainability right, whether or not it exists under Brazilian law, to what Christina was describing earlier. Because we have, on the one hand, even traditionally non-PD types of data, like anonymized data or non-personal data, if used for profiling by an automated system, maybe that brings it in. Or on the other hand, if you have an automated system operating in a particular area, you pointed to pre-existing laws that operate in the consumer protection, particularly in the credit reporting or credit scoring spaces. And there, I think you could also make an argument that, even in the United States, where we lack a where we lack a national data protection law. We do have things like the Fair Credit Reporting Act that mandate specific consumer rights in specific areas, specific uses of personal information. So I guess I'd like to take that concept and turn to Sarah. And I think you, of all of us, may have the broadest perspective on this subject as far as what, if anything, is the international academic consensus on this, I guess. Is there an idea that this is emerging as a shared principle in a variety of jurisdictions? And is that, I'm particularly interested, is it, as we seem to at least be getting to on this panel, is it tend to be tied to the explainability of AI systems in particular use cases that we find more concerning or more risky to users?
Yeah, I would say that we don't really have a academic consensus yet in terms of what explainability is. There are some amazing papers out there that help us to understand the landscape of explainability and how it can be thought of in a number of different ways. There's an amazing paper in Information Fusion a year ago that gives a landscape of of explainable AI that I think basically everyone should read, mostly because I think it does a couple things that help to smooth the rough edges of what both Renato and Christina were talking about. And that is the explainability where AI is used to do something with information about you, or AI is used to do something with information that can affect you. And that, I think, is a really critical distinction that needs to be clarified in any form of general data protection or general data privacy law, or anything that comes out pertinent to mandating things with respect to explainable AI. But what I think is useful about some of these papers, and the one that I'm mentioning in particular, is that it does try to decompose the idea of explainable AI into at least three parts, right? Simulatability, decomposability, right? And simulatability is the ability of you to think as if you're the computer, right? Can you reimagine what it means to try to make this decision? If you were given infinite time, space, and the ability to compute this, what would you come up with? And that's a way of giving people an explanation that they can hook into, right? Satisfies that necessity for people to have something that they can find meaning in, right? Decomposability is that ability to break down what a system does, right? What happens to the data about you? How is it brought together? How is it knit together? How is it turned into features? How is it brought into systems? How is the information manipulated with the systems to get to some sort of output, right? That helps you understand information that's about you, or that could affect you, even if it's not something that's directly from you. And then, whether or not an AI is interpretable, whether or not it's something that you can truly take on board as something that is a matter that you can do something with in your life. And if there's one area in which I think there is emerging academic consensus, it's that interpretability and explainability is audience specific. So while use cases is one way that we might think about it in terms of, sort of business focused or privacy law sort of focus, when it comes down to thinking about how is what we do going to be received and used, it really comes down to that interpretation, and then back to something in the GDPR of meaningful explanation, right? That is, I think, a word that carries a lot of weight that perhaps doesn't get quite as much attention as it may need to.
And so I love this idea of audience specificity here rather than interaction specificity. I am actually really curious, Christina, how you when you're dealing with this issue as an operator and a provider of AI solutions, how do you go about, internally determining as a first step, who you think, the right audience is for a particular disclosure, and then B, how do you cabin the right thing to put in that disclosure?
Yeah, well, a lot of the IBM solutions in the AI space are essentially tools that are used by our clients to train and develop and deploy AI with their own data. So because, as an enterprise company, we don't have relationships with the end consumer. We have relationships with the companies that ultimately develop and deploy the solutions to the consumer. So what we're focused on is building the tooling and the capabilities through something we call AI governance into those general purpose AI systems. So one of the things, for example, that we have as a capability in some of our products is something called a fact sheet. And the fact sheet is basically collecting as you go in the system and automating this across the development and deployment process so that you're essentially automatically gathering from those training and developing the system what data is being used. You're creating a log of it, the tests that are being conducted, the output, and you can generate at any particular point in time a set of facts that is captured automatically, but that's reflective of the model development lifecycle in the fact sheet. So it will also capture things like bias and privacy measurements. The idea of something like this will help reduce the human burden, right? That's often involved with logging this stuff manually. So the goal is ultimately to produce something that will be able to provide transparency across the life cycle and will be tailored and context specific to whatever audience, so that somebody who is the data scientist who's involved initially in setting up the system and training it and ultimately deploying it will get a different fact sheet, a different tailored fact sheet with a different level of detail and different explanations and the like. Then say it's in the context of a loan application, for example, that helps support decisions in the loan environment. The loan officer would get a different explanation, a different fact sheet than the person who actually created it, the data scientist who created it. So that's the design point. And that's sort of how we're thinking about it here at IBM through this broader concept of AI governance.
And I, as a quick follow-up to that, do you think that there is a way, or either a way to, or a necessity to build in, I guess, governance, like hard lines as a provider of a general AI system, where you can envision maybe a future use that has what you just would determine is an impermissible level of bias, and build into the tool some way to prevent if you're not in the direct relationship with the consumer, but you're in the relationship with other businesses that employ your services to go on and do other things. I mean, I know this is a big concept now in sort of how should we treat the different players in the design to market process for AI systems, in terms of responsibility for making disclosures, and also maybe in terms of responsibility for prohibiting behavior. So is that something that you consider as either in parallel or as part of this AI governance process and this fact sheet generation tool, and I guess the internal transparency really that you're describing?
Yeah, and I think that will evolve more over time too. Look, the AI ecosystem is a very, it involves many players throughout the life cycle, and there are different players. It's very complex. So you can't necessarily look at this as a simple, even a simple supplier provider kind of environment as you would in a typical product. So it's really, really, it's complicated from that perspective. But so it might not be maybe some of those guardrails, because we do think about guardrails as a company all the time, and whether they can be built in technically or not. Certainly from a contractual perspective, we've already started building guardrails, into our contracts and into our principles that we deploy into practices across the company. So I think there are, and I'm not the technical expert to explain like what kinds of guardrails we could put into certainly you could put flags in, you could put boundaries in your fact sheets to highlight. So think capturing drift in a model, that type of thing is part of the AI governance lifecycle and the machine learning operation, the fact sheet products that we deploy. So certainly there are technical abilities to do that. but we don't think about it just as the technical, and you have to think about it holistically. And as I said, contracts is one way that we do that.
Well, I think that's a really good point. I think that there, as we alluded to earlier, sometimes I think we can get tripped up as a profession where we only ever look at the sort of imposed from the outside rules, right? Like what are regulators saying, or what are international organizations saying? But a big part of this too is internal policies and the general practices as far as what do private entities and providers and all of the other pieces of this ecosystem do just in their private capacities. So I think that I would like to get a perspective from each of you on how this sort of explainability concept relates to not just interacting with consumers, but also, as we've alluded to here sort of obliquely, interacting with regulators, the people who are at some point going to be responsible for enforcing rules as they're made. I mean, we're very much in I guess, an experimental or novel space now as rulemaking goes, but we can see there are big pushes in a lot of jurisdictions. There's a piece of legislation on AI moving forward in Brazil. There is the ongoing process in the EU with the EU Commission's draft, and now the Council of Europe's compromise document. We're now waiting only on the European Parliament's version of the AI Act for the trialogue process to start. So I guess with that rather long-winded introduction, I'm curious what all three of you think on how, if at all, the explainability principle changes when you're communicating with a regulatory body or a regulator, as opposed to with a member, with either a business consumer or a consumer who's a member of the general public. Lacking volunteers, I'm gonna volunteer Sarah first.
I was really hoping Renato would take that with the LGBT, right? Because there's so much to be said there. But let me see if I can't answer that a little bit in brief. To talk to a regulator, you have to remember what their purpose is, right? We're not talking to a general purpose regulator. There's not a sort of regulatory Sauron to whom we're answerable. We are talking to regulators within particular verticals that have a particular remit that they're trying to work with. They're certainly going to be looking to see whether or not the AI that is being used it provides a sufficient explanation for them to be able to fulfill their remit, whether or not that's in environmental sides or within healthcare, whatever the case may be. And this, I think, addresses one of the challenges that you were bringing up before, which is sort of explainability within use context. And then you have to sort of imagine that it's not only that use context, that space, but also the individual. So if you can kind of see any type of explainability, it's always going to have sort of a substrate to it, or it's already going to have like a J sub I to it. If you look at, though, the difference between what regulators need and what individual people need, we have to remember that there's a massive gulf sometimes between what it is that individuals who have, say, their JD and doctorates and the very educated legal profession and legislative profession that we have in many countries, whether or not the EU, Brazil, or the United States, those are exceptional people that may not have, or that have tremendous access to education, to information that others do not enjoy. And if we have to try to think of a key difference, it's to make sure that the public is given what it is that they need to do things for themselves, and that regulators are given information necessary for them to do things on behalf of the public, right? Not to say that there is an absolute divide. Certainly regulators are going to need to know what we're telling the public about the AI. I'm sure that they're going to be asking for that information, but keeping in mind that they have different purposes. Individuals needing to protect themselves, their families, their communities, regulators needing to protect all of those and more within a particular vertical. So it's going to be very narrowly tailored, and trying to do something extraordinarily general on explainable AI. It's theoretically necessary, but it may not be practically useful just yet.
Lee, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, there's an interesting distinction that I think is also worth exploring. This difference between theoretically or maybe regulatorily or legally necessary and practically useful. And I think one of the biggest issues that we get to when we talk about both explainability and AI or transparency with regard to AI and machine learning in general is this idea of the black box problem. Where we may have certain kinds of artificial intelligent products or machine learning products that are so complex that it may not be possible to provide a meaningful explanation to how they function, input to output, without either crossing a boundary that requires at least some level of technical education or expertise, or, depending on the system that we're talking about, maybe at all. And so, if we run into this problem, I think that, one of the possible solutions to this that we've already covered to some extent is when Christina discussed, well, maybe if we can't explain how the system functions in total, we could be interested in how does it make this particular output happen. But I am curious as to whether or not there is a broader answer, or if there is another possible workaround. If we come to, for lack of a better phrase, a non-explainable system, what do we do? What's the solution in terms of providing information to regulators, providing information to consumers, and what's the way to think about it? I guess Renato, if you have a thought on this, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, sure. I guess we are on the brisk of employing some technologies that will be that will be by design non-explainable, and that's one of the things that we need to discuss, is that if we want or not that type of technology, if we want explainability by design embedded on it. But if we are in front of a technology or a device or something that is non-explainable, sometimes the solution that people come up is that, okay, so let me have access to the source code or something like that. Normally that will not work. Even if you have access to the source code, even if you have access to the algorithm, normally you cannot understand. If we go to methodologies of machine learning widespread, that will not function. And I guess we can come up with what sometimes people call a counterfactual explanation. Then you can, in order, and here I guess it is a little bit useful for this, that to make a difference between transparency obligations and explanation obligations, ex ante, ex post obligation. So when we are talking about ex ante obligations, we are talking about transparency in order to say what data is used, what is the input, we can have the output and so forth. And this is one instrument of accountability that we can have. When you're talking about ex post obligations, that we can talk about explanations as one of that. We are also talking about accountability measures. So in a way, as a right explanation, even on non-explainable systems, will function not only for the data subject to challenge that particular decision, but also to provide to the regulator, to the enforcement authority, enough information or enough comprehensibility of the system, that if it to check if it follows all of the compliance obligations that there is. So if one of the way of doing that is to provide what the purpose, what the impact that the particular automated system can have on people, but also if you cannot properly explain the technical concept of it, what would be if you change some of the variables, would the impact on people change? We talk about counterfactual explanation here. So this is one of the solutions that academics have provided. So in order to provide, instead of providing factual explanation, you provide counterfactual explanation and see how that can have how that can alter the results of the automated system, and then you can have a delta in order to provide explanation within that delta.
I think that's a very intriguing way of getting around the problem where, either examination of source code just doesn't tell us what we need to know, particularly for those of us lacking in technical backgrounds. And that doesn't even really bring in the question of, I think the real question of security and intellectual property issues for the underlying businesses that create these technologies. I'm curious, how do you think, is there a perspective on current proposals? I'm thinking particularly for the EU AI Act as it's being proposed by the Commission, and the requirements of human oversight for high-risk AI systems. What does that mean if we're dealing with a system that maybe isn't, either it's one thing to provide a counterfactual explanation for a data subject to sort of illustrate how a given system would produce outputs given certain inputs. But how does that work for somebody who wants to exercise, for example, a right to challenge a particular decision? And how do you insert a human into a process that we can't effectively explain? I'm actually particularly curious, Christina, if you guys have at IBM have thought about this, about what to do if at some point there is a mandate that like general purpose or specific purpose AI tools are required to accept this human over the loop interventionist, I guess, regulatory requirement. How would that be approached?
Well, I mean, it's definitely something we've thought about. In fact, with the principles that I mentioned earlier, one of them is that one of our threshold principles that guide our ethics board and the like is that AI should augment, not replace humans, that there should be a human in the loop. And I think that's how you in part get around this idea that, okay, maybe you won't be able to fully explain the output of every decision in a sufficiently satisfactory way, but that should be taken into account ultimately with the context of which the AI system is being used and by the person to whom the AI is being, that output is being delivered. If it's a recommendation that is one part of a process that ultimately is decided by a human, and it's accurate, you have all sorts of other data about the accuracy, the bias factors, et cetera, then maybe you care a little bit less about the technical output of how it reached that decision. If you could test it, if you could reverse engineer, sort of like go back, as you said, and sort of test the boundaries of that. But that's absolutely something we've thought about. We don't deploy AI solutions or systems and don't support the deployment of AI solutions or systems that don't have a human involved in some way, ultimately in the output, particularly, and that is really fundamentally in high stakes, without a doubt, high stakes decisions.
So do you think an important component of this then also is sort of explainability by design? Like the way that an AI product or an AI system interacts with, like you said, the end product or the end result, whatever that is, the end decision. I like your phrase, human enhancing rather than human replacing, where the way around this and the easiest way to add, I guess, this is more almost accountability rather than explainability, but is to require that a person be part of the process.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's how we look at it. I think that's how the AI Act currently is drafted as well. And this idea, again, of the governance and the fact sheets and providing as much transparency as possible, and capturing that over the life cycle. And then also providing the responsibility, ensuring that the responsibility is borne by different players throughout the ecosystem, right? The player that is most closely able to bear the risk and control the risk at that certain point in time in each stage of the life cycle, which is a complex life cycle, as I said, with many players, that's another mechanism by which you sort of get at that balance and ensure accountability.
So at this point, I see that we are coming towards the end of our time here this afternoon, and I want to make sure that we still have some time to take questions from our audience, if there are any. So with just over 10 minutes left in our session here, I'd love to open up the floor to anyone who is watching if they have questions for this panel, and see where there are some other things that we could talk about today, or if there's something that we already discussed that you'd like to hear more about. Please let us know.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on something that both you and Christina were addressing, is what do we do with systems that are not, don't seem to be explainable as yet? I think one of the key things to remember here is, one, most of the systems are just not explainable as yet. We will almost invariably get to the point where we can explain how any form of very large network model, even as people try to move into the quantum space and bring quantum computing in with AI, there will be that ability, that desire, particularly on the part of people who are building AI, to figure out, how did this work? And one of the things that I think Christina pointed out is that in the context of governance and drawing up the governance for creating explainable, private, ethical AI, we have to keep in mind that these developer communities have an inherent curiosity in themselves that we may want to, well, not exploit, but to resource appropriately, so that they can create explanations that are not only good enough for them, but can also be retooled to be good enough for regulators and for individual people. And so while we're talking about explainability sort of generally here, we also have to remember that explainability is an intellectual question and is a performance question that really does motivate people who have their hands on the keyboard in creating some of these systems. We want to know, how did we get this answer? And why, if we initialize a network with a different parameter, we get a different answer, because those really tell us not only how we're doing, but how to grade ourselves against other people in the community, and how to grade our algorithmic performance on all of the indicators that we've set out here today.
I have a question here from one of our attendees with regard to the function of explainability in the supply chain, particularly, I guess, in the context of a service provider. So I'm curious. Yes, this is one of those areas where we see emerging regulatory efforts to classify different parts of the AI supply chain in different ways. For example, the EU AI Act uses the distributor designation as opposed to and here I'm lacking the, I don't have the specific term on the top of my head for the other part of their regulatory process. But I guess, as a broad question, when we're talking about the software supply chain, if we have an end product that has, components from a number of different service providers, and some of those service providers might be using AI or machine learning powered technologies, where should the explainability onus lie, and who should be responsible for, either describing their piece of the puzzle or how it all works together, or is this a shared responsibility between these parties? And I guess lastly, is the best way to divide this responsibility via regulation, or is it best handled through contract between all the parties?
So I mean, I'll just jump in initially, and I think it's got to work holistically because of, again, this complexity of the supply chain where, you know, if we're a supplier of a general purpose AI tool, it's not being trained necessarily with our data. We, you know, pass it along and the client is then training it with their data, which obviously changes the end result and the output. It's worth very little, you know. So I think the way at least the way the AI regulation envisions that is that there would be cooperation. And the provider of the general purpose tool in the supply chain would be responsible for cooperating with the end user or the actual deployer who's putting it on the market. And whatever that means is now left for us all to discuss and to debate. And that's sort of why building in these, you know, automated sort of fact sheet capabilities that help to capture the data that's training the system at various points and sort of build in your policies into the tooling itself will be ultimately, I think, the path that a lot of these general purpose tools go and that we see at the output. So I think it's a combination of the tooling itself and how that's built ultimately in the end. And also it will be, I mean, whether it's from a regulation or not, it's going to be in contracts, that whole allocation of responsibility and liability. I mean, I can tell you, you know, I'm sure I'm not the only one who is as a supplier of AI capabilities that's already getting questions from clients and want, you know, certain contract terms and conditions and indemnifications and warranties that your solution isn't biased in some way. So that's to come. I mean, that's just the beginning, I think, from what we'll see from a contract perspective.
Actually, I have a follow-up question of my own based on what you just said there. And is are you seeing any new developments in the contract space as a result of just the increasing adoption and understanding, I guess, in the marketplace that AI or machine learning technologies maybe are a unique problem? Are you seeing, you know, new types of specific representations being requested by clients?
Yeah, I would say not a ton right now, but definitely there are some requests that we're seeing.
The point on bias intrigues me particularly there because I mean I'm not super far out from private practice myself, and that at least wasn't something that I had seen a lot of yet, but it was clearly on the future. You know, it was clearly on the horizon.
And I think what you'll also see, right, like is that end customer that wants to deploy AI in their operations in a customer facing application in some way. They want to make sure that they understand, how do I know when I'm deploying this that that's going to be trusted, that it's not going to produce bias output, that I'm not going to have a problem from a brand or legal perspective when I deploy it. And how they trust it, I mean, they're going to look for a trusted provider. They're going to look for those tools to be built in such a way that will enable them to deploy it in a manner, you know, where they can trust in the output, whether it's providing explainability, transparency, checking it for and making sure it's not biased, checking it for drift over time and making sure it remains the solution that it was originally designed to be and the output isn't evolving in a way that makes it less accurate over time or biased over time and the like. So that trust is fundamental. I mean, whether clients are asking for it in their contracts or not, they're definitely thinking about, you know, when I deploy AI, how do I make sure the solution that I am deploying isn't going to put me or my business at risk in some way.
Right. We have a question here specifically for Renato, shifting topics a little bit from the EU AI Act and its proposal. Separate from the LGPD, there is an AI draft law that's currently working its way through the Brazilian legislature. Could you give us a sort of a rundown of where that is as arguably the next major, you know, AI specific regulatory framework that may be adopted? And also, you know, how, if at all, does the Brazilian proposal deal with transparency and explainability here?
Surely. So I had to, recent was last month, we approved the AI bill of law in the House of Representatives. We have the House and the Senate, so it's bicameral, such as we have in the US. The draft was sent to the Senate. Right now, I must say it is a little bit on hold because of all the interesting scenario, political scenario that I have in Brazil. I do believe that all of you have heard some of it. But yeah, so the bill has a lot of, it's a very much principle-based approach, similar to what we have been seeing under discussion at the OECD at some level. And it does have some transparency obligations. For instance, I'll mention some of them. We have a principle of transparency that says it is not as the same way that we have in LGPD. We say that people have the right to be informed in a clear, accessible, and precise manner about the use of artificial intelligence solution and automated decision makings. So what if you can provide the level of explanation necessary to the people to properly understand the automated decision making in a clear, accessible, precise manner is one question. It's one thing that we need to address in the future. Another issue is that if we have a high risk automated decision making, some of the enforcement authorities which we do not know who will be the enforcement authority, if it will be the Brazilian Data Protection Authority or any other one. It can request more information on the safety and countermeasure environments and safeguards that were used to deploy the artificial intelligence technology mechanism. There is also some guidelines on transparency. It encourages the creation of transparency and collaborative governance mechanisms, including not only the public sector and the private sector, but also as a civil society and the scientific community. And it also allows for federal public authority that is also, we do not know who would have the competence on it to promote strategic management and guidance for transparent and ethical use of artificial intelligence in the public sector. So there are some, at least I can say that this language, depending from where you're interpreting, it allows or does not allow the proper transparency and explanation requirements. But I guess I can say, Lee, that probably we're gonna see in the near future some other proposals, some other bills of laws, or there's another one in the Senate that might even take a head start in the coming months or in the beginning of next year. So, but we'll see. But if the way as it is for now, as far as I know, it is the first AI law of the world. I know in Latin America, there is also some other countries who are discussing their own AI law, but there's not as advanced as in Brazil.
And this is something for all of our attendees to pay attention to. If Renato is spot on about the timing, the proposal in this area in Brazil will be months and months ahead of the conclusion of the trilogue process in the EU, even though we talk about the EU AI Act a lot. So I think that this is really an area for everybody to pay attention to. So I do see that we have reached the end of our scheduled time here. And I do not have any additional burning questions in our Q&A panel here. And I know all of my panelists, although they have been wonderfully generous with their time so far this afternoon, do have other things going on in their lives they would love to get going to. So I guess I'd just like to thank everybody for coming and being part of this discussion. I thank all of you for coming and watching and listening. And I hope we get to do it again sometime. I found this really illuminating. This is a good discussion.